Shall we go ahead? Okay. Still waiting for a few more people to come on. Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, depending on from which time zone you're joining us. And thank you for joining us for this event. My name is Verena Borton, and I'm president of the Davis chapter of UNA USA. On behalf of the United Nations Association's Davis and Sacramento chapters and the Davis branch of the American Association of University Women, we welcome you to this celebration of International Women's Day with the United Nations focus on women in leadership. International Women's Day has been recognized by the United Nations since 1975 on March 8th, but it has actually existed for over 100 years. It is celebrated in many different ways across the world, in some countries resembling Mother's Day. You can't help but notice the red square at the top of the slide, which denotes Sustainable Development Goal number 5, gender equality. And this is one of the goals that unites our 3 sponsoring organizations in partnership. And as you can see below, partnerships for the goals is in itself another one of the global goals. And we are very happy to have been able to partner for this event. As I looked over programs of past events for International Women's Day by the Davis UNA chapter, I couldn't help but notice a common theme, namely the emphasis expressed by speakers from many different countries, including Mongolia, India, Ecuador, Russia, Morocco, Indonesia, El Salvador. Emphasis on a few salient topics: peace, action, cooperation, and the belief that no matter the obstacles to gender equality, with passion and effort, it is possible to achieve one's goals. Today's program, Peacemakers Around the World, and specifically Women Peacemakers, follows in that tradition. And I just wanted to add a comment here that at the United Nations and in UNA, we talk a lot about peacekeeping, because that's a very important function of the United Nations. But this program is about peacemaking, and we will hear more about the difference between the two. Instead of listening to women from around the world speaking with us, as in past years, this year we have the great good fortune to be joined virtually from Colorado by author Barbe Chambliss, who has interviewed countless women around the world and will bring us some of their stories. And as you will see, those stories again illustrate or demonstrate these same qualities: peace, action, cooperation, and a belief that with passion and concerted effort, one can achieve one's goals or dreams. Before I introduce Barbe Chambliss, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Edgar Trujillo, president of the Sacramento UNA chapter, for some additional comments.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Edgar Trujillo, and as Verena mentioned, I'm the current president of UNA Sacramento chapter. And I'm honored to be here today with you all, and grateful for Verena's willingness to co-sponsor this important event with us that highlights some inspiring stories of achievement from ordinary women who persevered and prospered against all odds in their search for a better life. Today's event is being live streamed on Facebook Live, and we will also make this event available on our YouTube channel within 2 days' time. Additionally, if anyone is experiencing any technical issues, please post them in the chat. Furthermore, we will have a Q&A session after Barbe after author Barbe Chambliss's presentation. So please be sure to post your questions in the chat throughout the event so that we may have plenty of questions ready at the end for our presenter. Lastly, we'll be sending everyone that registered for this event a contact list of all our co-sponsors and our main presenter, Barbe Chambliss, and her website, the link to the presentation on YouTube, and additional opportunities for you to get involved with our advocacy work. Thank you.
Okay, now comes the introduction of our speaker who is flying to us through space from Colorado. Besides being an author, Barbe Chambliss is a psychotherapist, a mediator, an organic farmer, a facilitator for restorative justice, and a musician. And there are probably many other qualities that aren't included in this list. We will benefit from her varied expertise in this presentation, although for me, unfortunately, we will not be benefiting from her organic farm products or from her skills on playing the marimba. Dr. Chambliss's PhD dissertation, entitled Contemporary Women Peacemakers, The Hidden Side of Peacemaking, led to several decades, this is decades, not years, decades of interviews with women throughout the world in a search to find out how peace is actually made. Through personal experiences and countless collected stories, Barbe Chambliss continues to explore the practice of peacemaking, which she defines simply as people treating each other with equal respect. And I would say emphasis on equal. The stories come not from world-famous individuals, but rather from ordinary women, many of whom are reluctant to even consider themselves as peacemakers. From dozens of interviews, 15 were selected for the book Women Peacemakers, What We Can Learn from Them. It was published in 2020, and we'll see a reference to it later. Barbe Chambliss will now explain in greater detail how she views conscious peacemaking, and then bring us stories from different regions in the world, compressed into short segments, painfully compressed. She's really having a hard time offering all she wants to say in these short segments. While you listen, think of opportunities in your own life that may lead to conscious peacemaking, or potentially already have. Maybe you will think of some things that have already happened in your life that apply here. After the last segment on Native Americans, there will be time for questions. In responses to your questions, you may hear about some of the other stories that are not covered in the formal presentation. Please welcome Dr. Barbe Chambliss.
Oh, thank you, Verena. And thank you for all the co-sponsoring entities who have collaborated to allow me to share these women's stories with you. These stories are very near and dear to my heart, and I also think they're very instructive. So we've got lots of students. I see we have, like, right at this point, we have 24 students, and these women will be your teachers for a while. So just to give you a small introduction to the book, ever since I was a little tyke, I have really been curious about how peace is made. And that got more intense when I grew up and went to high school and college, and some of my classmates ended up being drafted and going to Vietnam. And after they got out of boot camp, they knew how to tell me how war was made. And I kept going like, yeah, but wait, isn't there a counterpart to see how peace is made? So occupationally, I pursued, as Verena explained, how to be a mediator. I taught 500 children and adults in Colorado to be mediators. I work with people in prisons. I've done restorative justice things, and it gives me some sort of idea formally about how one makes peace, but I really wanted to know how the everyday person could participate in a world that was full of peacemakers. How do you go about it? And when I got to my graduate school, it got academic and serious. So I interviewed 9 women peacemakers for that dissertation on the hidden side of peacemaking, women peacemakers, the hidden side of peacemaking. Some people ask me why women, because when you do a PhD, you have to fill a gap in the literature. And there was quite a bit of literature about Gandhi and Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela and the man that was actually negotiating the peace in Ireland at the time, but not so much about women peacemakers. And even though there were some Nobel Peace Prize winners, they were very hard to reach. Aung San Suu Kyi was in house arrest. Rigoberta Menchú Tum was in hiding. So I said, how about ordinary women? I kept thinking, like, you know, Desmond Tutu must have had a great mom, or Nelson Mandela might have too. And I thought, let's focus on the women. So I went about seeking women peacemakers that I considered to be like me, ordinary people. But when you looked at what they did, it was extraordinary. And the first thing I had to do was develop a definition. And so I have developed one that includes my hands, and you can see it on the picture that's here, but I'll do it for you right here. So when I put my hands together, like someone's going to pour them full of cold water, I call this peace. And it's peace because it's mutual, it's equal respect. If you do this, it is not peace because there's a dominant and a subordinate element to it. And that makes for no peace, or it makes for less than peace. And so I would say to people, do you know anybody, a woman, that is making this happen? And that phrase, I have to say, was magical. It was the easiest way to get nominations for women for this dissertation you can imagine. And to Verena's suggestion, peacekeepers, I guess if you want to get technical about this, I would say that peacekeepers, peace happens sort of like this. It's never stable. And so peacekeeping has to do with keeping the things in this level of togetherness. Peacemaking often starts when there's a huge gap between dominant and subordinate things. Not that we need to be picky about it, but it really takes a village to make peace. And some people are protesters, and some people are mediators, and some people are peacekeepers. And this is the stories of some women that are peacemakers. So I asked, as soon as I got a nomination from the women, and I got nominations for women all over the world, so I would call them up cold. I had to grow into doing that. And I would say, my name is Barbe Chambliss, I'm doing a dissertation. Would you allow me to interview you about your peacemaking work? And they would often say, oh, I would love to be interviewed about my work, but I'm not sure I'm really a peacemaker. And I went like, I'm in trouble, because my dissertation committee basically said you need to have 2 nominations, one by someone else and one by the woman. So my high school age son solved the problem for me. He basically said, Mom, ask them their definition of peace, and then ask them if they do any work that brings that about. And that was how I started every interview. And it worked. So they would go like, oh, here's my definition of peace. And oh yeah, I do work to make that happen. And I would simply say, well, do you think that qualifies you as being able to be called a peacemaker? And sometimes there is this total silence. They often called themselves nuns or lawyers or psychiatrists or whatever they were. But to fit it into that category was something that by the end of the interview, they were happy with, they could do. Some of them called themselves peacemakers in the beginning, but it's a transition. And it's not an easy transition because, as Verena once said, it feels a little presumptuous to call oneself a peacemaker. And I'm going to encourage you, especially at the end of this presentation, to presumption be damned. Call yourself a peacemaker if you're doing certain things that actually bring about these kinds of situations. So when I interviewed these women, I asked all the women the same questions, even though their stories are about as diverse as you can get, and they're from all over the world. And the questions I said were, what is your definition of peace? How did you come to do this work? How has your family influenced your work, and vice versa? How has being a woman influenced your work, and vice versa? What kind of compensation do you get for your work? And by the way, the answer was never money or rarely money. It was always that I am making a difference in someone's life. I asked them to paint a picture for me of what the world would look like if their definition of peace were in operation. I asked them, what role, if any, do you think forgiveness plays in peacemaking? I asked them for a metaphor of themselves. And I asked them, what advice would you give someone that wanted to be a peacemaker? So the first 15 chapters of this book are 15 women's stories. Chapter 16 is their answers to the question about advice. What advice would you give to someone that wanted to be a peacemaker? Chapter 17, even though the women are very different, I saw some commonalities about how they go about their work. And that comprises chapter 17, which is what I call lessons learned from Women Peacemakers. And there are 24 things that kind of were common among them. Things like be awake when the opportunity floats by, like never give up your goal and never get attached to how you get there, like work with and not for, like don't use violence of any kind, including to yourself, like this one's tricky, think systemically and act holistically. And some people stumble over that. They go like, what does that mean? So the very first woman I'm going to talk to you about today exemplifies that think systemically and act holistically so perfectly that I've chosen to do her story for you, even though she's not in the book. But she's one of the 60 women that I've interviewed over these 30 years. So we'll go right to Cambodia for this talk. And we are going to be getting to know a woman. And here is a piece of something I need to admit, a little embarrassingly, but as interviewing women all over the world, I would interview them and you'd think it was easy to get their names. But sometimes I didn't know which was their first name and which was their last name. And this is the classic case of that. So I don't know whether she is Booth Saman or Saman Booth. So I'm going to call her both names because if you look her up in the internet, she's known by both ways. So if anybody out there is from Cambodia and would like to tell me which is her first name, I would be very grateful. I will say that. So let's see if I can do this now here. All right, so as I tell you about this, listen for that systemic holistic thing. So after I did, when I was doing my dissertation, I paid my tuition by putting it on a United Airlines MasterCard or Visa. And it gave me enough miles to go do these interviews overseas and often take one of my children with me when I did it. But when I finished with the dissertation, I did a presentation for my town, which is in Western Colorado. It's the largest organic farming community in the state, and it's called Paonia. So I put on a presentation for the citizens of Paonia, and the next morning I was walking downtown and one of the people that had been there came up to me. His name was Michael, and Michael was a conservation, he's traveled all over the world doing habitat conservation talks. He said, Barb, that was a great presentation. Where are you going to go next? And I said, well, I'm out of miles, but I'm saving my money to go to Asia because I haven't interviewed anybody there. And Michael said, you know what? I fly all over the world giving talks. I have so many air miles. I want to give you enough air miles to go to Asia. Whoa. So my first response was to go like, oh, that's way too big of a gift for me to receive. My second response was to zip it and just give Michael a huge hug and say, thank you very much. And I thank you from the women that I'll interview too. So 3 months later, I had lined up 13 interviews in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. And my first interview was with Saman Booth in an office in Cambodia. I did not know very much about her. Her name had been recommended to me, and all I knew was that she was the executive director of something called the Children and Love Association. Now, this association later became renamed. It's now called Children and Life Association. So I was thinking of an executive director, sort of with high heels and earrings and things like this. But as the door opened and she walked into the interview room, I saw that she was in pants and big, thick boots, and she was taking off a helmet. And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a few minutes late. I just had to ride my motorbike 100 kilometers to get here from where I work." And I thought, I'm going to like this interview. So when I asked her definition of peace, it was my first hint that there was something unusual about her life experience. She said, peace is where people can live in situations where they're not scared, where they're free to do something on their own. Saman Booth was the oldest of 8. She said it a lot. She contributed a lot, or attributed a lot, to her mother, who was very generous. She thought that's where her peacemaking work came from. Her dad had been in the military and had died in an operation. And she actually was married herself, very happily married, and going to the university. Among other things, she decided she was going to study foreign languages, which really put her in the upper echelons of the university life. Everything was going along just fine until April 17th, 1975. On that day, Pol Pot marched into Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, with his Khmer Rouge army, many of who were primarily youth. He'd been Marxist trained, and he was a student of Mao Zedong, and his intention was to create an agrarian utopia. Now, for those of you that are near my age, you're going to remember this genocide vividly. For those of you that are not, I'm going to tell you how Saman Booth identified what it was like for her. She said nearly 2 million people out of a population of 7 million people died. I was studying foreign languages at Phnom Penh University when they took over, and they evacuated us and made us march from the city out to the countryside. It was like we were slaves. We were forced to work 15 hours every day, 7 days a week, and we hardly had any food, just very weak rice soup. We started work at 4 a.m. in the morning, and we finished at 10 p.m. at night. The work was very hard. We were digging canals and working in the rice fields. We were always frightened and didn't know when we would be killed. We knew that if we were sick, we would probably die. We always had to say yes to the Pol Pot people. If they asked us if we had enough to eat, we always had to say yes, even though we were starving. My 21-year-old brother was murdered by a Pol Pot soldier because he said that he didn't have enough to eat. There were always spies and the Khmer Rouge people listening to everything we said. We could say nothing, and it was like our mouths were sewn up. One of my friends from the university made a mistake and said a French word. A village spy heard her say this and reported her to the Khmer Rouge, who took her away and killed her. We never knew who was the spy. This type of thing happened every day to children and adults. So he arrived in 1975, and in 1979, he was overthrown by the work of the Vietnamese and with some international help. But it left Cambodia with nothing. No roads, no schools, no hospitals, no government departments, and no one in leadership positions. He had killed all the people that were educated or were in leadership positions. So there was a huge vacuum, and it left a room for a civil war that went on until 1993. And then finally the United Nations came in and helped them have democratic elections. But even today, Cambodia is still suffering from this genocide. The bulk of the people still live in outlying areas and are trying to subsist on agricultural production. During this time, Saman Booth went to work with, there were a lot of NGOs that came into the Capitol to try and help. And she went to work for the Save the Children and the Australian Catholic Charities organizations. And they put her on the street as a street patrol person. She just got to know the kids. She would talk with them at night. And these kids were there from all over Cambodia trying to do very tricky, very difficult, and very dangerous construction jobs. But the girls were sex trafficked immediately as soon as they came up. They were trying to earn some money for their families who lived out in outlying places. So she said to her NGO, she said, you know what? I think I'm going to quit my job as a street patroller here, and I'm going to go where I see 60% of these kids have come from. It's a province in the south, and it's called Praving Province. And I'm going to find out why so many children from that province end up here in the streets. So she got on her trusty motorbike the next day, and she rode 100 kilometers to a town called Mae Sing, and she had no idea what she was going to do, what she would find out, but she was going to do it. This wonderful lady. So I said to her, wow, what did you find out? And she said, it was poverty, but the pieces that contributed to the poverty were more numerous than you can imagine. She said, first, the soil was terrible. And they also had a season that was a wet season and a dry season. So the only crop they grew was rice. And in the dry season, there was no rice. So there was no food to eat. And if somebody had gotten sick, they had borrowed money to go to get health care for the sick person, but the money lenders charged 30% for debt. So they would send their kids to the Capitol during the dry season to A, they didn't have to feed them, which they didn't have the food for anyway, and two, maybe they could bring home some money. So they had the health problems, HIV was around, no children under 5 didn't live very long as a group, and maternity situations were quite deadly. And there was a PTSD among all these people from the genocide. I mean, no one trusted anyone, no one would talk to anyone. And they also happened to have a fairly high alcohol rate because there was enough, you could eat rice and you could make rice wine out of rice. And that often ended up being abused. And then you'd see the abuse enter the families. So there was also a pretty worn path between the countries in the North, Taiwan, and up and other places where the recruiters would come down. They knew when the dry season was coming, and they came down and they started recruiting these kids for trafficking and for construction jobs. I said, woof, so what did you do? And in fact, I don't know why, but at this point I said to her, so what advice would you give someone that wanted to be a peacemaker? And she said, I would do just what I did. I'd tell them to do what I did. I went and I listened. I listened to the radio, I listened to storytelling, I listened to the police, I listened to parents and children just to find out what was going on there, healthcare workers. And number 2, she said, it was really clear, it was huge. There were so many ways things that needed starting, so I knew I had to prioritize. And number 3, she said, don't try and do it all yourself. Go to work with the people that are already working. So she set up shop. And the first thing she decided to do, because her very heartfelt goal, she was there for the children. And these children, one of the big problems was the children had no rights. Meaning, if the parents said, go up to the Capitol and bring back money, the kids had to do it. They didn't have a right for education. They didn't even have a right for a voice to be heard. And that was where Saman Booth began. She got the 13 to 18-year-old kids together and she taught them about children's rights. And she taught them to teach children's rights to the kids. They had a right to education, they had a right to safety, they had a right to have a voice, and they had a right to be listened to. And this cadre of teenagers, unlike the teenagers that came in with the Khmer Rouge, were pivotal to the success of her program. So then she started children's clubs where the children could start talking about their lives. They made it safe to talk about their lives. And in fact, they made a village theater and they put on plays, sometimes street plays, sometimes indoor plays. And they brought the adults as the audience, and the children would put on plays about their family situation. And the adults got to see the alcoholism in their family or the fear, or they got to talk about what it was like to go to the Capitol, and the adults learned what was going on. Then she created something called child protection committees. These were elected committees in each community, and they had community leaders, they had police, they had monks, they had parents, and they had some of these peer educators. And the job of these committees was they knew when these recruiters came down, and they simply met them at the edge of town and told them to go away. They knew when a child didn't show up at school. They knew when there was trouble in a home. And as a community committee elected, they went about working with these tasks. She realized that the adults had so much PTSD from the war. She started mother-to-mother groups and father-to-father groups. The mothers often talked about how to raise their kids, and they began to learn from her and learn from each other in these. The father-to-father groups, interestingly enough, she said they would pair a popular man in a group with somebody that was involved with alcohol, and it began to make a huge difference. And then she tackled the whole situation with food. The soil was pretty well depleted, so she taught them composting. And then she taught them permaculture, which gave them more than rice to eat. And she not only taught them how to grow it, she taught them why it was nutritional. And then she expanded their diets by getting ducks and chickens and pigs into their farms. And now they could feed a family for the whole year. And they had some money if healthcare things happened. She taught a lot about nutrition and maternal and infant health and HIV prevention. Now, by the way, you may notice that she did all of this turnaround stuff so far without any money. This was just things you could do with people that had gotten to trust you. She did introduce a microloan project for some people, but even more, she introduced these self-help savings groups where she would take a family of 15 families, a group of 15 families, and they would pledge, each family would pledge to save either 50 cents to $20 a month. And they'd put it all in one pot. And if somebody got sick, they could borrow money from this pot at 3%, not 30% interest. Always it got paid back. And when the group had collected $1,000, they would start a small business, like she helped them start fish paste business and things like that. So what happened is the villages began to turn around slowly. It took a little while for all this to take, but because they were doing it communally and together, they began to trust her and they began to trust each other. And in fact, the whole process was replicable in other villages in Prevang province. And by 11 years later, when I read some research for her work, she had 169 villages in this province learning the same sorts of things. So I just want to close her chapter by telling you that I won't go over it too much. I just want to compare two individuals that were in Cambodia. One was a dictator. He used things like bullying and power over and eradicated individual rights and starving people. She used things like teaching, like growing personal power from within, like reestablishing individual rights, especially for children, like teaching sustainable agriculture. So each of them had these tactics that they used on purpose. His ended up being a war, a genocide. Her purposeful, conscious peacemaking tactics ended up reviving a community and the self-esteem of the individuals in it. So basically, I could just sum that up by saying the road to war starts with humiliation. The road to peace starts with mutual respect. So now, for just a minute, let's change continents. Let's go to Africa. And we're going to visit with Chito Govera. I just want to tell you very quickly that the book, we put the photos the women submitted to me, the colored photos of all of them, on the front of the book. And then we asked someone to do sketches of each one in black and white. So what you're seeing are the sketches here of the chapters that are in the book. So Chito was a young Zimbabwean girl who lived, she never knew her father. She lived with her mother in a little hut with her little brother and her nearly blind grandmother behind an uncle's house. And her mother kept going away and coming back, and then going away and coming back. And when her mother would go away, Chito's uncles would get to her uncles and her cousins. They lived in the big house in front. And sometimes they would abuse her physically, and sometimes they would abuse her sexually. So when her mother came back, she always wanted to tell her mom what had gone on. She was a thin little kid, kind of a sickly little girl. And her mother kept being sicker and sicker. So she really never was able to tell her mother or ask her mother for protection until one time her mother came home and she died. And Chito didn't find out until later that she had died of AIDS. But this left Chito as the oldest girl child in the family, even though she was only 7 at the time. And traditionally, the oldest girl child is in charge of feeding the household. So she had to go find food for her little brother and for her nearly blind grandmother. She tried to stay in school, but she couldn't make enough after school. She'd come home and she didn't have anything to eat, and she'd hear her little brother cry himself to sleep. So she finally quit school and went to work in the fields. But the other thing that happened when her mother died and she had no father is that she really became fair game for any male and whatever they wanted to do with her in this culture. After a while, when she was when she was 8 years old, she had a dream while she was living in this little hut. And the dream was that she was going to help orphans all over Zimbabwe and have a better life than she had. She wasn't sure how, but that was her dream. And then she woke up and went out in the fields and started to work. But one day someone gave her a scholarship. They nominated her for a scholarship for 1 week to go to Matare, one of the main towns in Zimbabwe, to take a course in how to grow, of all things, mushrooms. So she was a very apt student. She and 14 other kids were given this opportunity to spend 1 week learning how to grow mushrooms. And from that 1 week, several things changed for Chito. Number one, she came home with food for her family. Number two, she came home with enough mushrooms to sell, and then she could send her little brother to school. And she had a tradition of it. Her blind grandmother had been one that would take her out in the woods and show her the mushrooms there. So it fits so well for them. But the big thing she learned there was that you don't have to put up with your uncles. So the plan was for all of these young orphans to, they called it H1 Teach One. So they were going to send all these orphans around the world teaching other places where to grow mushrooms. But what the planners of the organization didn't get, that when you send a young girl home to a village who's got a skill that makes money, like mushroom farming, they get married off right off the bat. So Chito and one other girl were the only ones that went back and took the 3-year training and really how to make a business out of mushroom growing. And Chito did her due diligence. She taught all over the world. Language was never a barrier because she would show people how to grow these mushrooms, and they would use spent waste material. Like we brought her to our town here. I brought her to Paonia, and not only did she raise money for her dream, but there were 15 of us that took a mushroom growing plant from us, a class from us. So we came home with mushrooms and she came home with $2,000. So about this time, Cheeto began to get depressed. And one of the nonprofit organizations that had sponsored her mushroom class, the head of it is it's called ZERI Foundation, the Zero Emissions Research Institute. And the head of it was a man that had taken quite an interest in how bright Cheeto was and how good she was. And he went to her and he said, "What's going on?" She said, "I don't know, but I can't think and I'm not doing very well at all." So he got her into the Paraclesis Institute in Switzerland, where her stories of abuse came out, and they helped her. They said, you can write them out, you can draw them out, or you can talk them out. But because she was a fairly timid child, she decided to write them out. And the way I'd found out about Cheeto is my neighbor here in Paonia had given me a book that said Hope for the Future. And it had Cheeto's picture on it. She was probably about 16, no, about 19 maybe at the time. Very scared, but really clear eyes. So after she did her teaching all around the world, she said, you know what? I'm going to actually do this Center for Hope. The Future of Hope, she's going to call the center. And she started talking different places and making money for her own organization. She found the land in Zimbabwe. She got a group of people to make a board of directors that helped direct her. And she sent me halfway through her ideas about the mission of this whole thing. And I want to read this to you. So this is a 20-year-old girl that sent this to me. She said this, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's estimated that about over 50 million children are orphans. It only makes sense to start encouraging these millions of children to start doing something for themselves. They understand their problems more than anyone else can understand them. And for this reason, if we're to deal with the problems of orphans effectively, we're better off giving them the tools and skills to do it for themselves, to stand up for each other. While emergency aid may be needed and welcomed, long-term solutions for the orphans by the orphans offers the best learning tools for vocational and interpersonal skills. It's time we all start seriously acknowledging the potential of these children, to believe and trust that the world needs them to step up, and we have to give them a chance and mentor them. It's vital they're able to believe that they can empower, inspire each other, not only be empowered, and that we support them in this. We have to stop pitting them and support them to break out of self-pity, to understand that they can change things. Yes, they've gone through rough experiences, but they must bounce back for their sake and for the world at large. That is the future of hope. And it is not just for orphans, but for everyone that's considered disadvantaged. We can make everyone take responsibility and make things happen when we can allow for that to happen without fear of losing control or feeling that our positions in power are threatened, when we stand a chance for a hopeful future. So with this philosophy, she found land. She found a way to start building a building. She started inviting orphan girls to come to her program. And she realized that if she sent these girls back to the villages where they came, nobody would realize what a gem she was. So she would bring women from the community to these trainings too. And the women would go home early and say to the community, we've got a real gem coming home. We're not going to treat her like an outcast like we did before. She built a school so these girls could finish their educations. She built a market for all the mushrooms that were being built. She taught them permaculture, and she brought in chickens. I just talked to her a few months ago, and she calls these Roadrunner chickens. And I said, why? She said, because these chickens are huge and they have great breasts on them for meat, but they run like crazy and we have to go chase them down the road. And now she's beginning to do her work, not with individual orphans, but with households and with villages. So this is the vision of the Future of Hope Foundation. Our vision is of an inclusive world where there is hope and a future for all. A world without poverty, abuse, self-pity, or victimhood. We want a world where everyone can thrive, be engaged, and reach their full potential in the betterment of humanity and nature. We envision a world where everyone can be a change agent, starting with where they are, with what they have, and regardless of their backgrounds. So this gem of a girl gets to go at peace, and then I'm going to take us to the Middle East. And I need to hurry up. So in this story, I want you to listen for the phrase and the explanations about mutual respect. And then I also want you to listen for somebody having just an intuition about something's not right, something's unfair, it just feels unjust. So I was interviewing a psychiatrist in Tel Aviv, Israel, and at the very beginning of the interview, she wanted to tell me this story. And it was of what it was like in Israel when she was a little girl. And this was pre-1948 when Israel became a state. She said, this part of the neighborhood, there were Jews who were born in Jerusalem, and some from Oriental origins, so different from my parents and the European descent Jews that we came from. Oh wait, I have to go back and tell you that her grandmother lived with them. Her parents had immigrated from Europe, brought the grandmother with them, and the grandmother had made a pledge to God that she would go to the Wailing Wall every single weekend, and she chose to take Ruchama with her. So this is a description of what Ruchama experienced walking to the Wailing Wall. Next to these European descent people were the most religious Jews. There's no one in the world more religious people than they were. All these neighborhoods were so close, 3, 4, or 5 minutes walking distance. On the north side, there was a whole neighborhood of people who came from Eastern Europe and in whole other countries. People who came from Kurdistan, Jews, all of them, so different origins, different songs, different languages, different clothing. Even their religions were different, even though it was all Judaic. And then in less than 20 minutes, there were the Palestinians. At least 6 or 7 very different communities living all in the same small town. There was no love, but there was no hatred. We were just all together like this, being on our own selves. So then she explained that she had done her obligatory military duty as an 18-year-old. Men and women are obliged to do that in Israel. And she was delighted to find out that some of the heroes, the military heroes, were going to be her officers. But what happened is she saw something that really upset her. She saw these officers treating the prisoners in the most disrespectful, degrading way ever. They were in a war with Egypt. They would see the Egyptian soldiers crawling across the sand. They had very little clothes. They were starving and thirsty. And her leaders would taunt them and then shoot them. And it kind of blew her mind. So she went to talk to her commander about it. And the commander said, I think we better send you home. So she got out of the military early, but it caused a huge depression for her. She couldn't make sense of all this. So then she went to medical school. And while she was there, she had 2 children. She decided she wanted to become a psychiatrist because she wanted to know why people behaved the way they did. After she got out of medical school, there was another war. It was called the Intifada, although Ruchama called it the War of Independence for the Palestinians. This was in 1987. And she was living in Tel Aviv at the time, and there were rumors of what was happening out in the occupied territories, but you couldn't find anything in the media about it. And then she said to me, I really know when the truth is not being told. I didn't know what the truth was, but I knew they were telling us lies. And there are 2 strong dislikes for Ruchama. She doesn't like being lied to. In fact, the name of her chapter is Don't Lie to Me. And the other thing is she doesn't like it when she senses there's something unjust or unequal happening. So she decided to pick up her phone and call 11 medical volunteers that she knew from the school and said, well, let's take a trip out there and find out what's going on. We'll go with we'll do medical services out there. So they went to the Shifa hospital in Gaza, and they found out was poorly equipped, had almost no equipment. And they also went to the Muqasid hospital on the West Bank. And they were blown away by what they found. There were people, mostly Palestinians, that were beaten. A lot of right arms were broken so that nobody could carry guns. People had been shot at point blank. And I said to her, was this the army, the Palestinian army this happened to? She said, no, there was no army at that time. The Palestinians had decided to do nonviolent resistance. They just didn't go to jobs or didn't pay their taxes. So this was being done to civilians. So she and these 11 people came back and said, this is not right. And this became the birth in 1987 of an organization that she headed up called Physicians for Human Rights Israel. So from that 11 people that started on that trip that day, 2 months later, they had 100 volunteer members for it. And in less than a year, they had 200 members. And Ruchama said this to me: all these meetings for all these people were in her small apartment, 200 people, please. She said, and then I found myself leading this group. It wasn't intentional. I didn't sit down and say, what group am I going to invent? People referred to me in a way as the leader by asking me, what should we do? I didn't have the answers, but it happens in motherhood when your children are asking what to do, what you're supposed to do, and then you find yourself giving answers only because you were asked. So I gave answers. We did a lot of thinking together, but more and more I found myself in this position. They would ask, what should we do? And I would figure out the answer. And I have to tell you, this was a similar story to many of the other women peacemakers that happened to start a project alone and then found people attracted to it. So from her intuition that something just wasn't right or just in the occupied territories, plus her strong intention to promote a just society where the right to health was granted to all people under Israel's responsibility. Now, today, PHRI is called Physicians for Human Rights Israel, PHRI, is today an organization that is supported by more than 3,500 members and volunteers. And each year they serve more than 20,000 people by providing medical care and assistance and for the right to health. And by the right to health, they mean the right to get treatment when they're sick, to cross the lines and not be stopped at the borders when they're being taken to ambulances, to be able to have water and food and safety. So they expanded the definition of health to be as all-inclusive as they could. They have open and mobile clinics. The mobile clinics go to different outlying villages every week. The open clinic is free. They have volunteer medical professionals who provide free services to all the people who are limited or have no access to healthcare. Now that means not only Palestinians, but all the migrants, all the refugees, and a lot of the people living in the West Bank and Gaza. They now have healthcare because of this organization. At the same time, it works to change the system that created all this problem. The discriminatory and abusive structures and policies towards Palestinians in the occupied territories, also for the people in the prisons and the detainees, for the migrant workers, for the refugees, for the undocumented persons, and for the Israeli residents that don't have any social standing. Just as an example, you'll hear on the news that Israel has vaccinated all the people, but I just read that nobody that wasn't a state citizen got a vaccination in the beginning. This organization had to get vaccinations for all these other groups of people. So when I asked Ruchama her definition of peace, she said, when peace is made, it's a synonym for respect. The main point is that when people respect each other, they are willing, and this is really important, when they respect each other, they are willing to share power. That's the opposite of military power of occupation or oppression, she said. Live and let live. Don't try to know what is better for others. So very briefly, I'll tell you an example. I asked her to tell me an example of mutual respect. And she said, there had been a massacre in the town of Hebron So they took their mobile unit out there, and people said, don't go out there. They're going to hate you because you're Jews. They went out anyway, and they knew that the Palestinians that they were going to serve with their medical wagon that day were in Ramadan. And the Palestinians don't eat food during sunup to sundown in Ramadan. So they thought, usually wherever we go, they make us a lunch and we sit down and eat, but that won't happen today because of Ramadan. Oh no. The Palestinians had prepared a meal for them, and she said, we sat down to the table and ate the meal that they'd prepared, and they stood behind us and did not eat. And she said, that's one of my best examples of mutual respect. At the end, I said, can you paint me a picture of the world what the world would look like if your idea of peace was in place? And Ruchama turned to me and said, I already did. It was walking to the Wailing Wall with my grandmother. Okay, now we're going to come to America. And the assignment I got was to, I might just be not as late as I thought. The assignment was to represent somebody from the Americas. So I've picked this woman because not only is she Native American, but she also represents the Honduran Mayans. So we got Central and North America here. So here's how this whole thing started. I'd heard a report by a midwife that was up at Standing Rock. I think Amy Goodman was interviewing, and she said there had been a lot of forced sterilizations of Native American women. And I went, what? I majored in American history in my bachelor's degree. I never heard of anything like that. So I started looking it up, and it turned out not only was she right, but it was way worse than the numbers that she said in the interview. And I went like, oh, I want to go talk to this woman. And also I'd heard that at Standing Rock, they were not wanting people to install fracking. And our community, our farming community, had to fight the frackers because they were going to frack oil near our reservoirs for our water, for our farms, and near our kids' school buildings. So we knew what the fracking community was like. And then the third thing that helped me go up there was I had a bang up crop of apples that year. I had 26,000 pounds of apples. So I had a lot of friends that came and picked apples before we sent them to the juicery. And I asked each friend if they would pick a box to go up to Standing Rock. Not quite sure what Standing Rock at that point was, but they said, sure, we'd love to do that. So when they all went home, I had 35 big, heavy boxes of apples. So a friend joined me, and we got a U-Haul, and we picked up a wood stove and a lot of wood and some saddles and some hay for the horses. And the organic farmers from here gave us a lot of fresh produce. And we drove 880 miles in this U-Haul up to Cannonball, North Dakota, which is where the Standing Rock camps were. So just to catch you up on what was going on up there, there was the Energy Transfer Partners that were digging a pipeline called the Dakota Access Pipeline. I call it DAPL, right across the ceremonial burial grounds for the Lakota Sioux Indians, and also right next to Lake Oahe, which was the water supply for them. And also it was going to go on and be dug clear under the Missouri River. So it wasn't just Native American problems, but they were the ones that were holding up their hands and saying, stop. So by the time I got there, the sides had chosen up, and the Dakota Access Pipeline people, the Energy Transfer Partners, had this kind of arsenal. They had the sheriff and the deputies, they had state troopers, they had National Guards from several states that showed up, and they also had, we think, some private mercenary forces from hired by the Energy Transfer Partners. And they were equipped with things like rubber bullets, tear gas, water cannons, batons, police dogs, automatic weapons, helicopters, small airplanes, and a communication semi. There was a whole semi-sized communication truck that scrambled all of our cell phone and internet whenever they wanted to. And the other side of the whole situation were the Dakota Sioux, and they had started with a few youth building one camp, and the camps grew. And their arsenal was prayers, a corps of wise elders, a handful of horses, one drone, multiple indigenous prophecies, and effective training in nonviolence, and lessons learned from 500 years of suppression, plus 2 herds of buffalo, and a level-headed chief that took their concerns not only to the public, but he took it directly to the United Nations. Their biggest, I guess you could call it weapon, were people. They started off with a few youth building one camp, and at the end they had 15,000 people that came to Standing Rock. And these were the tribes from all over the United States united behind this effort. I saw flags from they thought every single Native American tribe had shown up there, and some from the different countries. They were also a lot of white people, young adults, Native and non-Natives. There were a lot of medical personnel. There were movie stars. And at the end, there were 2,000 retired veterans that came. So we got there at night. And when I got up the next morning, I've been thinking all night, like, how do you keep this many people from raising havoc? And I got my answer the next morning. I walked over to the camp where I thought I could see the midwife. And there was a big piece of plywood at the end of the ramp. And it said, painted on it was was direct action principles. And here were their guidelines. Number 1, we are protesters, and they had scratched out the word protesting and put the word protectors. Number 2, we are peaceful and we are prayerful. Number 3, isms have no place here. Number 4, we are nonviolent. Number 5, respect the locals. Number 6, we are proud to stand. We don't wear masks. And they were referring to the riot masks of the military. Number 7, no weapons or what could be considered one. Number 8, property damage does not get us closer to our goal. Number 9, all campers must get an orientation. Number 10, direct action training is required for all taking action. So I took that direct action training, and I'm telling you, at a woman my age with 2 hip replacements, I realized this is a job for the young and agile people. So I backed out and just served people apples. Number 11, no children in potentially dangerous situations. Number 12, we keep each other accountable for these principles. And number 13, this is a ceremony. Act accordingly. So it turned out that the midwife was never available, and instead I ended up being able to interview a clan mother whose name is Rachelle Figueroa. And Rachelle had just gotten home from spending 3 days in jail with a whole bunch of the Native Americans. And she was willing, I was grateful, she was more than willing to do, she had done a sweat lodge for all the women that had been incarcerated because they were pretty shaken up. But she said, sure, I will meet with you tonight and do an interview. So she's interesting. Her name is Rachelle Figueroa, which doesn't sound very Native American. She was born to an indigenous native, a Michoacan native from Tarascan, Mexico. And her father was from an Arapaho nation around the Wind River in Wyoming, but she never knew them. This was a time when a lot of Indians from Native Americans from all over the United States were being relocated to places in California. And she ended up being available for adoption in the shuffle of all this. So she was actually raised by a very kind Czechoslovakian mother and a very generous father from Panama. They taught her the value of doing community service, and they said everyone was welcome at their table. So she grew up as a kid in Los Angeles. She had no idea she was Native American. Then she wanted to do surfing, so she and a boyfriend ended up moving over to Hawaii. And I said to her about this, I said, did you ever know your birth parents? She said, no, I never did meet them. I had to look them up in the records, but she said, I did know all of my ancestors. They kept coming to me in my ceremonies, in my dreams, and in messages to me. So after she'd been in Hawaii a while, her mother got sick. She went back to Los Angeles and realized that she needed to move back home to take care of her aging parents. And she started visiting the Native indigenous populations there. And it turns out that Los Angeles had one of the largest populations of Native American youth. And more she learned where she was from and what she was doing. And she traveled actually around the world. She had a big emphasis on reuniting youth with their elders and telling women that it was time for them to stand up. When I asked Rachelle for her advice for people who wanted to be peacemakers, her advice was, tell them to go find an elder. So in her travels all around, she ended up carrying the peace pipes. There's a thing called a chanupa, and it's a container, a sack, a leather container for a peace pipe. And she carried peace pipes for the Muskogee Yamasee Nation and for the Lakotas. And then she also was asked by a Mayan council of El Salvador to carry their sacred staff of peace and unity. So she had learned all the history, all the traditions, all the, they weren't myths, all the traditions from them. So she was telling me about the Mayans information. She said the Mayans call this time the time of the glistening trees. This is the change from the 5th to the 6th world. Looking at least 500 years of what has happened to Turtle Island or North America, there's been such a patriarchal control of the planet. Because of so many wars and much disharmony and non-peace, it's come to a point where the prophecies say that this is the time now for the leadership of the female face to stand up. The male dominant time is over now. We now have come to this point where unless the women stand up together, unless the women understand the power that they hold within themselves to make this shift, this new shift that's happening right now, then there's a good chance that this planet will fall apart. So I said to her, Rachelle, there are two things I want to say to you. A week before we drove up here, we just elected a very male, it was Donald Trump, to be president of the United States. What advice do you have for us about that? She said, do what the elders say, prepare, don't be blind, do what you need to prepare for all these changes. And then she said, I don't care if the president is a Martian. I just do what I came here to do. Just think, she said, if everybody did what they knew was right, if everybody stood up and spoke for the voiceless, spoke for Mother Earth, spoke for the water and the animal relations, if all the indigenous and all the conscious peacemakers that are not indigenous would stand up and just do what they know is right, no one can stop that. So I said to her, I'm willing to show up and correct the compass of our world if I can, but I don't want to be alone in doing it. And she said, you don't have to do it alone. She said, Chief Phil Lane Jr. has said this to me. In order for the eagle of humanity to soar to its highest potential, it must use both wings. One is woman and one is man. And Rachelle also showed me a speech that she had given at an International Day of Peace. And the quote that I pulled from it is this: standing side by side with men of good heart and clear mind, we can balance out the negative forces of hatred, greed, war, and planetary destruction. So it had been a long interview, and I said to her, is there anything else you want to add? And she said, yes, I would like to add this. We should all acknowledge that each one of us was put on this planet at this important time in history for a reason. It's our duty and responsibility to speak up for the voiceless, to pray humbly for strength and courage to speak up against injustice, greed, and the destruction of our sacred water, air, and earth for the benefit of our present and our future relationships. These prophecies are always talking about what will happen in the future, but they're actually talking about us. This is the future they were referring to. And what they have prophesied, we are now living. We are it. So now whoever is on the planet at this time will determine what is to happen to our planet. We can't wait. It is us, and it is now. Thank you. So I am late. I'm a little sorry we're late, but let's go for questions and answers if you would like.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Barb, for taking us around the world, introducing us to all these extraordinary women who are yet ordinary people, and inspiring us with their life journey and impact they had on their society and the world in truth. Now it's the time for questions and answer. Please put your questions in the chat box, and as we go over the questions. Barb, the first question for you is, did you ever feel impeded by language barrier? So often meanings vary by language.
Yes, it's a really good question and an obvious one to ask, but it turns out I offered translation for every woman that I interviewed, and 4 or 5 of them needed it. But it was so amazing. I mean, it's very humbling to realize that you've interviewed 60 women and most of them speak English, and I don't speak their languages. So, but often what they would do if they did not use translators is, for instance, I would ask them the question, can you give me a metaphor for yourself? Or what is your definition of peace? And they would craft the most beautiful sentences from their language and English that would, somebody that grew up in speaking English in an American school might never have come upon. So yes, and I will say that when I did have translators, often the stories of what had happened to the women were hard on the translators. I interviewed one woman that was the longest held political prisoner by in Tibet by the Chinese. And there was a young male translator, and having him listen to what happened to her in prison, I kept my eye on him. As a trauma therapist, I went like, whoa. But he was great. He was very brave, and I don't know what he did afterwards. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. The other question is, what was your most surprising experience during an interview?
Wow. I was so open to anything these women told me, but maybe I could change the word surprising to hopeful. I interviewed a woman from Soweto, which is, and apartheid had just, I mean, Nelson Mandela had just barely come out of prison. And her name was Lucky Maseko. And she said, and my teenage son was with me, 21-year-old son. And she said, it's too dangerous for you guys to come to Soweto now. So where else can we interview? And I said, well, I'm here on an exchange to do mediation, and they've put us up in a hotel. Why don't you come to our hotel? And she went like, oh, that would be really nice. So we were in the dining room eating dinner, and she answered all the questions. The little tape recorder was going on the table, and she turned to me and said, you're getting a PhD? And I said, yes, I am. She said, how? I said, well, I happen to be going to a university that lets me do most of it at home. And then we go travel twice a year to meet with the Asian students and the European students. She said, so could anybody do something like that? And I said, yeah, that's what the school's all about. She said, could I do something like that? And I said, yeah. And Lucky started, she said, why not? And then she kept asking more questions about it. And after I'd tell her one thing, she'd go like, well, why not? We called her the why not lady, my son. And for all I know, Lucky has gotten a PhD from someplace after being a little kid in I mean, what she did was she started the first daycare in Soweto. So when all the mothers and fathers traveled for work and these kids were running rampant around there, she provided breakfast for them and a daycare for them to be safe and in. And it breaks my heart that I've lost track of Lucky. But I'm thinking I might ask Trevor Noah if he knew about Lucky, the why not lady.
Great. The second question is, why do you think folks have a hard time recognizing one's peacemaking potential? And to expand upon it is, do you think there is a generation difference in this approach and understanding this potential, peacemaking potential?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So let me just go back a little bit and tell you about the last chapter of my book. About halfway through the 30 years of research, I ended up interviewing a woman who was doing a camp. She sent me a flyer to raise money for a camp she was doing in Bosnia for the kids that had barely made it through the Bosnian War. And I called her up and I said, well, I don't have much money right now, but I could volunteer. And she said, great, that's what this camp is all about. She was in Los Angeles, so I imagined myself cooking in a kitchen, a camp kitchen for kids. And it turned out it wasn't in Los Angeles, it was in Croatia. And I wasn't a cook, I was a counselor. There were 80 children that had barely made it through this war. And then when the camp was over, they asked us to come back to Sarajevo and to their refugee camps. So I got to see what war does to children, to their beliefs, to their sense of safety, to their feeling like they're worthy of anything, and to what it happens to an infrastructure. Like they had completely gutted out the entire library in Sarajevo of all the history of the former Yugoslavia. And I came home and I was really changed. This wasn't an academic thing anymore. I really needed to step up as a conscious peacemaker myself. And I needed to wake up as many people as I could to be conscious peacemakers. So I've put the last chapter in the book as an invitation to the reader or the listener, because I've recorded the audio, to take on an act of peacemaking themselves and then write it up and email it back to me. And I thought that would be easy, and it hasn't been easy. The question is it generational? Well, I happen to have I'm also trying to meet with people, say between 15 and 22, and mentor them going through that chapter, doing an act of peacemaking. And I've got a very willing 22-year-old. And she's way ahead of me. I mean, she's learning from the women as she reads the chapters. But let me tell you, she will step out as a legislator or a peacemaker way faster than people my age who are very reluctant. And when I describe to them what an conscious act of peacemaking is, they go like, oh, well, I've done some of those. And I say, well, would you call yourself a peacemaker? And there's some hesitancy there. But I'm telling you, anybody that reads this book, I really encourage you to read that last chapter, look at something you might have done in the past, or something that you just see that doesn't feel just or doesn't feel right, and use these women as your mentors to stand up as a conscious peacemaker. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think it did. It's 3:20. We have 2 more questions in chat, and but we have time for another one. Let's go through these 2. Can you tell us about an experience in Europe with Peacemaker?
Mm-hmm. The very first European interview I did was with a woman named Sister Sarah Clark, and she's in the book. And I had gone to a music concert near my little town where I lived, and there were 5 Irish brothers singing. So I thought, oh, good, I need somebody in Ireland. Ireland was in a terrible mess at that time, very violent. So I went backstage and I said to them, I'm doing a dissertation on women peacemakers. Do you know any women in Ireland that meet this thing? And they went like, oh, no, we don't know anything about that. But we've got a sister Fanula who is a disc jockey in Dublin. Here's her telephone number. So I called the sister and she had 2 people for me. And so I took my little 9-year-old, and that was the first place we went, she was in London working as a nun, keeping up the spirits and getting lawyers for all the political prisoners that were in the British jails. And boy, was she alone. I'm telling you, she was a very brave woman. She actually, she would meet the families that came over from Ireland and prepare them for what it was like to go visit their prisoners. And what she would prepare them for often was being strip searched, which was her biggest nightmare. I mean, she was a nun and she wore a black habit the whole time. But when everybody else got the Hope gave all the nuns permission to have regular clothes, she collected the black habits and then took her clothing allowance, and she would buy writing paper and pens for these prisoners and say, don't fight your way here, write it out and then give it to me and I'll tell your stories. And she was really amazing. I actually met somebody who she had helped in the prison after she died, and he had tears telling me the story of how she helped him. So, yeah.
Thank you. The last question that we have is, what are some of the current conflict resolution or peace building efforts in Yolo and Sacramento counties? Are you aware of some of the women leading these efforts? I understand that you are from Colorado, then you may not be familiar with what's going on in California, especially in the specific Yolo and Sacramento County. Then the way I can rephrase the question is that in general, in United States, if you can have an example that how any conflict resolution or peace building efforts we have in an example, I'm sure that there are many.
There are an overwhelming amount of them. They're so exciting. And I just wish they got as much press as the violence makers have gotten, because I think there's probably way more people making peace than there are making violence right now. It's interesting. So I keep doing research in little areas. So I'll tell you one that I just came upon last week, which I was doing some research about Native Americans. There's a young girl named Annie Young. And I think she's a Native American peace activist, which is a rarity. I mean, you wouldn't have had this probably 25 years ago. And she's in the Los Angeles area, but she's a Navajo. And she went home and she said, you know, we have a terrible voting record. We need to get more people out to vote. And her dad said, oh, you know, people don't know where to go, and they don't believe it'll really work, and they don't think their vote makes a difference. And she said, Dad, how can we do this? And he said, well, they don't have cars, so they can't travel there. He said, we're horseback people. So Annie dressed up in a traditional Navajo outfit and started riding her horse, and her dad was with her. And they went around and they collected a whole bunch of voters who got on the horseback, and they all went in to vote, to the voting sections. That to me is a pretty interesting example of current peacemaking. So.
Thank you very much, Barb. I just want to mention that we have in chat a reference to a Yolo Conflict Resolution Center. The website is there, and also UC Davis has some activity about that you can refer to that to answer the question that is specific to Yolo and Sacramento. Also, I would like to mention that on this page, you see Barb's email address and also the website that will be sent to you again, as Edgar explained. And if you have any question, I think Barb is kind enough to, if you email her, she wouldn't refuse the answer to your questions.
No,
Thank
and
you
if they would put in the subject line AAUW or UNA question, that will help me better identify them. Yes, I would be happy to answer questions if people have them.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, I think now it's time for the closing section that Trish will lead us.
Yep, I got to unmute. Well, this is a wonderful presentation for International Women's Day, this concept of women as peacemakers. As Barb said, this book is very representative of women peacemakers all over the world. And these women are not famous women. They're ordinary women. So today it's also pertinent to reflect on the United Nations theme for International Women's Day 2021. It, quote, celebrates tremendous efforts by women and girls around the world in shaping a more equal future and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, and highlights the gaps that remain. Women's full and effective participation in leadership in all areas of life drives progress for everyone. Yet women are still underrepresented in public and decision-making, unquote. Now, I wanted to share with you very briefly a part of a poem written by Anna Jarvis. And some of you may know Anna Jarvis was the founder of Mother's Day after World War I. She was quite incensed and dismayed later on that this became a very commercialized day, only really interested in making money, because that was not her intent. But the part of the poem that I wanted to share with you is where Jarvis wrote, quote, "We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs," unquote. And looking at John Paul Lederach, a professor of international peacemaking at the University of Notre Dame, he writes, the, quote, well-being of our grandchildren is directly related to the well-being of our enemies' children, unquote.
Right.
So we want to remind you that Dr. Chambliss encourages everyone to send her their story of peacemaking. And of course, there are more opportunities here to observe International Women's Day in the region. Tomorrow, March 8th, United Nations Association chapter of Silicon Valley is presenting a program entitled Empowering Women as Global Leaders. And on Thursday, March 11th, the United Nations Association in Sacramento will present a discussion on the discrimination against Black women in healthcare in Sacramento. And lastly, I want to take a moment to applaud the partnerships here between the United Nations Association chapter in Davis, the United Nations Association chapter in Sacramento, and the Davis branch of the American Association of University Women, the AAUW. And of course, a big thank you to Barbe Chambliss.
You're very welcome. And I have a quick question for Edgar. Will we be sent the chat information?
I can absolutely send you that, Barb, no problem.
I'd like to know what the rest of the questions were. That would be great.
Yes. Thank you all so much for coming, and we wish everyone an excellent rest of your weekend. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chamberlain.
Bye-bye.